The hum of engines rumbled low beneath the airport floor, like a heartbeat pulsing steadily through steel and glass. The morning light spilled into the terminal in wide golden bands, casting a soft glow on the polished tile. Travelers moved with quiet urgency, some dragging wheeled suitcases behind them like faithful shadows, others pausing to sip coffee or check flight boards with the practiced calm of the seasoned airborne. At gate B14, a teenage girl stood alone. Amira Langston was 16, though she moved with the composure of someone older, someone who had learned long ago how to carry herself through spaces that weren't built with her in mind. Her sneakers were clean but unbranded. Her hoodie, soft and charcoal gray, bore no flashy logo, but her presence, quiet, grounded, and assured, made people look twice. Tucked in her small backpack was a first-class boarding pass, seat 2A, a window seat. It wasn't her first time flying, but it was the first time flying alone. And certainly the first time in first class. It had been a promise from her father. If she finished the year with straight A's, she could choose anywhere in the country to visit. Amira had chosen Seattle, where her aunt lived near the harbor, and told stories of whales and cedar trees and summer evenings cool enough for sweaters. Her father had smiled, and true to his word, he'd booked a ticket that same night. What no one in the terminal seemed to know, what Amira had no desire to advertise, was that her father, Victor Langston, was not just a generous parent. He was the chairman and principal shareholder of SkyNova Airlines. The planes bearing the company's sleek blue and silver livery were part of his legacy, built from years of innovation, negotiation, and vision. But to Amira, he was just dad, the man who made pancakes on Sunday, the man who still checked if she had her inhaler in her backpack before she left the house. She boarded quietly, waiting her turn, holding out her ticket with a calm smile that didn't quite mask the tremble of excitement in her chest. The gate agent didn't look up from a scanner. The beep confirmed her seat, and he waved her through with a half-muttered, "Enjoy your flight." Amira stepped onto the jet bridge. Inside the aircraft, the cabin whispered of luxury, cool tone lighting, plush navy seats with wide armrests, and that faint scent of citrus and leather polish unique to first class. She located her seat, 2A, right by the window. Her fingers brushed the smooth leather as she sat down. For a moment, she just breathed, in, out, letting it sink in. The silence, the space, the gentle hush of comfort usually reserved for people who wore suits and commanded meetings. With deliberate care, she slid her backpack under the seat in front of her and smoothed the front of her hoodie. The seat controls gleamed discreetly by the armrest. She reached for her headphones, ready to get lost in her favorite playlist and let the world outside melt away into clouds and sky. "Excuse me." The voice was crisp, female, professional in tone, but with something brittle beneath it. Amira turned. A flight attendant stood at the aisle. Her name tag read Clara Whitman. She was tall, perfectly groomed, and wore her authority like a second skin. Arms folded neatly across her uniform, she offered no smile. "Yes," Amira said politely. "That seat," Clara said, tilting her chin slightly toward 2A, "is reserved for first-class passengers." Amira blinked. "Yes, I know. This is my seat." Clara's eyes narrowed, not rudely, but with practiced suspicion. "May I see your boarding pass, please?" "Of course." Amira reached into her hoodie pocket and handed it over. Clara glanced at it briefly. Something flickered in her expression. She looked again, more slowly this time. Then, without returning the pass, she said, "I'm sorry, but this seat isn't available. You'll need to move to economy." The words landed like a slap, not loud, not cruel, but wrapped in the kind of certainty that came from someone used to not being challenged. Amira felt heat rise to her cheeks. "But this is my assigned seat. You just saw the pass." Clara's jaw tensed. "I'm not sure how you acquired this, but first class is reserved for premium travelers. I'll help you find your correct seat." Around them, the first-class cabin was beginning to fill. Passengers glanced over, some curious, others looking quickly away. The man in 3C lowered his newspaper slightly. A woman with a briefcase at 1D paused mid-conversation. Amira's voice remained calm. "I didn't acquire anything. My father bought this ticket. That's my seat, 2A. Clara looked down at the pass again, then back at Amira. "And where is your father now?" The question hit harder than expected. Amira blinked. "He's not here. I'm traveling alone." There was a pause. Clara didn't speak, didn't return the boarding pass. Instead, she looked down the aisle and motioned toward another flight attendant. "Megan," she called softly, "could you check on seat 27B? I believe we have a misassignment." Amira's heart began to race, not with panic, but something else. Something slower, heavier, the sharp pinch of humiliation. Still, she said nothing. She could have yelled, could have stood up and declared who her father was, could have pulled out her phone and made one call, but she didn't. Instead, she did what she had been raised to do. She stood with quiet dignity, took her backpack, and walked slowly down the aisle, past the suits, the side eyes, the silence, past the stares that said, "You don't belong here," even when her ticket said otherwise. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Because what Clara Whitman didn't know, what no one on that plane yet realized, was that sometimes the people you push down are the same ones who hold the sky beneath your wings. And Amira Langston, she wasn't just a girl with a window seat. She was the daughter of the man who owned the plane. The narrow corridor of the economy cabin felt colder than it should have. Not in temperature, but in something less tangible. Something woven into the very silence that met Amira Langston as she walked past rows of faces, many of them indifferent, some vaguely sympathetic, none brave enough to speak. She found her way to the empty middle seat in row 27. The fabric was rough, the armrests stiff. It wasn't the lack of luxury that stung. It was the way she'd been removed from it, like someone being corrected. Quietly, publicly, and unjustly. Amira settled into her new seat, mechanically buckling the belt. Her headphones still dangled from her fingers, but she didn't put them on. Her gaze fixed blankly on the back of the seat in front of her. Her shoulders drew in. Her breath slowed. Not to calm herself, but to contain the weight she refused to let spill out as tears. She'd made a vow to herself long ago: they will not see me break. To her left, a boy no older than 10 chewed loudly on gum, and on her right, a woman flipped through a celebrity gossip magazine, completely unaware, or perhaps pointedly uninterested, in the injustice that had just unfolded feet away. Amira pulled her phone from her pocket. Her fingers hovered for a moment before she typed one short message. "She made me move to economy, even with my ticket." There was no need to say more. Her father would understand. The response came within seconds. "Are you okay?" She stared at the question for a long time before replying. "I'm fine." But she wasn't, not really. She tucked her phone away and turned to the window, even though the seat beside her didn't have a clear view. All she could see was the wing stretching out against the early morning light, motionless for now. Back in the first-class cabin, Clara Whitman stood near the galley, pouring herself a measured cup of black coffee. Her hand trembled slightly as she stirred in one sugar. The moment should have passed, another routine boarding hiccup handled swiftly, but it hadn't. Something about the girl's steady voice, the direct eye contact, the refusal to raise her voice or make a scene, Bassan, it unnerved her more than she liked to admit. Clara turned, only to find herself being watched. Emily Rhodes, a younger flight attendant she'd worked with for years, raised an eyebrow slightly. "Everything all right?" Emily asked casually, but the tone held weight. Clara smoothed her uniform. "There was a seating error. I handled it." Emily said nothing, but her gaze lingered a moment too long before she turned back to the beverage cart. Moments later, the intercom crackled. The captain's calm voice came over the speakers. "Flight crew, prepare for departure." Clara resumed her duties. The doors closed. The jet began its slow, rumbling taxi toward the runway. Amira's hands gripped the seatbelt tighter as she felt the familiar forward thrust of takeoff. The cabin tilted. They rose. 30,000 feet later, she still hadn't blinked. Meanwhile, in a boardroom far from the clouds, Victor Langston had stopped speaking mid-sentence. The room around him, the oak-paneled executive conference suite of SkyNova Airlines, was frozen in confused silence. Marketing executives and legal counsel all waited for him to continue, but Victor's gaze was fixed on the screen of his phone. The message from his daughter glared back at him like a wound. He read it again and again. This wasn't just any incident. It wasn't a baggage mishap or a delayed boarding. This was his daughter, quiet, composed, dignified Amira, who had never once called him for help in a moment of public discomfort. If she had messaged, that meant the situation had crossed a line. He turned to his assistant. "I need to speak with the flight deck of Flight 4732 immediately." There was a pause. "Sir, the flight is already airborne." "Then patch me in through secure relay," Victor said, standing, "and bring me the crew manifest." Back on the plane, Clara was adjusting the beverage cart when the call came through. "Is Whitman?" The captain's voice came over the crew intercom, quiet and controlled. "Please report to the cockpit." Clara blinked. That was unusual. But she nodded and left the cart in Emily's hands. The walk to the cockpit felt longer than it should have. When she entered, Captain Mason Gray turned from the console. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he gestured toward the mounted screen beside his seat. It was already active. A video call. The man on the other end wore a dark gray suit and a measured expression that suggested power never needed to raise its voice. Victor Langston. Clara felt her throat tighten. "Ms. Whitman," he said evenly, "I believe you removed a young woman from her first-class seat earlier today." Clara's hands went clammy. "There was a misunderstanding. Her appearance didn't match the passenger profile." Victor raised a hand. She fell silent. "You removed my daughter," he said quietly, "from a seat that was rightfully hers." Captain Gray turned away slightly, letting the weight of the moment settle like fog. Clara's mouth opened and closed, but nothing came out. Victor continued, "You will, before this flight ends, correct this mistake. And then, when you land, You will remain on board until security escorts you from the aircraft for a formal review." The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They carried the quiet gravity of someone who had built the very walls she stood inside and could just as easily remove them. Clara nodded faintly, her throat too dry to speak. And in that moment, at 35,000 feet, the balance shifted. Because for all her years of service, for all the stripes and authority Clara had carried on her uniform, she had failed to see one simple truth. Sometimes the person you dismiss without a second thought is one holding the compass. The silence in the galley was deafening. Clara Whitman stood frozen beside the cockpit door, her fingers still curled tightly around the silver latch. Her face remained composed, at least on the surface. But inside, her thoughts raced in spirals, looping again and again through the captain's words, through Victor Langston's quiet warning. "You removed my daughter. You will correct this. Correct this." The two words haunted her as she made her way down the aisle, each step a reminder of the arrogance she hadn't realized she carried until now. The cabin lights glowed softly as if mocking her, casting long shadows across the rows of passengers who had returned to their movies, meals, and half-read magazines. None of them knew what had just taken place behind the flight deck door. But some would know soon. Clara walked back to row 27 with the poise of a professional, but her heart thudded like a drum beat echoing down a hallway. As she approached the row, she paused, drew a slow breath, and forced her face into a mask of calm. Amira Langston was still seated, staring ahead, unreadable. Clara cleared her throat. "Miss Langston," she said softly. Amira turned slowly, her expression composed but distant, like someone bracing themselves for another blow. "Yes," she said, her voice even. "There was a misunderstanding earlier," Clara began, her voice carefully modulated. "I'd like to personally apologize for the inconvenience. You're invited to return to your original seat in first class." Around them, passengers turned slightly, casually at first, then with growing interest. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The energy shifted. The tension was thick. Amira didn't move. She studied Clara for a moment, long enough for Clara to feel the weight of her silence settle into her chest like cold iron. Then Amira asked, not bitterly, not with heat, but with the soft bite of clarity. "What?" Clara blinked. "Why, what? Why did you assume I didn't belong there?" Amira asked. Her voice was low, measured, but it held a quiet strength that pierced through the air like thread through fabric. Clara opened her mouth, searching for words. Any words. "I didn't. It wasn't personal," she murmured. "But you didn't ask anyone else to show their ticket," Amira continued. "Just me." "I—" Clara trailed off, her throat dry. Emily Rhodes had stopped the beverage cart halfway down the aisle, watching now with a mixture of sympathy and caution. A businessman 2 rows back had put his laptop aside. An older woman clutched her pearls, not dramatically, but as if to hold on to something familiar. Amira looked down at her hands. "You could have just asked politely, or checked the manifest, or radioed the gate, but instead you pulled me from my seat like I'd done something wrong, like I was trying to steal it." There it was, the thing Clara had tried not to name. The assumption, so swift and automatic she hadn't even realized it had taken root. Amira stood up, still no raised voice, no outburst, only quiet dignity. "I'll go back to my seat," she said, hoisting her backpack onto one shoulder. But if you're going to apologize, at least say the truth. Clara's lips parted, and for the first time in a long career defined by control and order, she had no script to follow. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "I judged you, and I shouldn't have." There was no applause, no dramatic swell of music, just a stillness that settled between them, thick with implication. Amira gave a small nod and stepped into the aisle. She didn't walk with pride or vindication. Her gait was smooth, slow, and deliberate, the walk of someone reclaiming space that had always rightfully been hers. As she passed Emily, their eyes met briefly. Emily said nothing, but in that glance there was an acknowledgement, a flicker of shame, and perhaps something like admiration. Back in seat 2A, Amira settled in without a word. She didn't look around, though she could feel the glances. Some apologetic, some embarrassed, a few quietly stunned. The man across the aisle, Leonard Blake, a retired corporate attorney, cleared his throat as she buckled in. "That," he said hesitantly, "was unfortunate." Amira didn't respond. She wasn't angry, not anymore, just tired. Clara followed several steps behind, slower now, her footsteps heavier than before. She stood near the front, unsure whether to stay or retreat. "I'll be nearby if you need anything," she said stiffly. Amira nodded once, not unkindly, and turned toward the window. The sky beyond the glass was beginning to shift, clouds parting slightly, letting slivers of light spill through. It reminded her of Seattle, of her aunt's stories about storms and silver linings, of how sometimes change doesn't roar in like thunder. Sometimes it arrives quietly, on the wings of truth. The cabin hummed with a steady rhythm, filtered air, soft footfalls, the faint clinking of ice in glasses. Yet beneath the calm, an invisible current stirred. It coiled not through turbulence in the skies, but through the silence between glances, the murmurs between rows, the weight of what had just transpired. Amira Langston sat motionless in seat 2A, her spine straight, her gaze cast out the window. The world below was hidden behind a thick quilt of clouds, a sky so pale it seemed to absorb the sunlight entirely. It felt oddly symbolic, beautiful, distant, and unreachable unless you'd earned your way through. She didn't look at the other passengers. She didn't need to. She could feel their awareness settling over her like snow. She wondered if they would have said something if she hadn't returned. If she'd stayed tucked in 27B, would anyone have asked where the girl had gone? Would anyone have cared? Her fingers curled into the plush armrest, not out of anger, at least not entirely, but from the weight of a question she hadn't yet learned how to put down. At the front of the plane, Clara Whitman leaned against the galley wall, her breath shallow. She stared down at the label on a bottle of sparkling water, pretending to read it, though her mind was miles away, spiraling through headlines, complaint forms, reprimands. She'd been flying for over 15 years. She knew the ins and outs of this job like the back of her hand. Safety checks, passenger temperament, crisis management. What she hadn't prepared for was this. Not the mistake, the mirror. It was one thing to correct a seat. It was another to be told, without yelling or threats, that you judged someone for simply existing in a space you didn't think they belonged to. She closed her eyes for a beat too long. When she opened them again, Emily Rhodes was standing nearby, a tray of drinks balanced expertly in one hand. "You okay?" Emily asked. Clara forced a tight smile. Fine. You sure? Because I've worked with you long enough to know when you're spiraling inside. Clara didn't reply, but the slight twitch of her fingers gave her away. I heard what happened, Emily continued, lowering her voice. Back in economy. That was a tough moment. Clara nodded. It's done now. Maybe, Emily said softly, but I don't think it's over. In a corporate suite nearly 1,000 miles away, Victor Langston ended a call and turned toward his assistant. He looked composed as always, but behind the measured expression, something more potent simmered. Resolve. Has Captain Gray sent the crew manifest? He asked. Yes, sir. It's in your inbox. Good. I want a full report drafted within the hour. And alert Daniel Harper from HR. She'll need to be met at the gate when they land. You're assigning a corporate escort? The assistant asked, brows raised. I'm assigning consequences, Victor said calmly. She humiliated my daughter, but worse, she made an assumption we've spent years trying to uproot. He paused, his eyes narrowing. If she thinks wearing a uniform gives her the right to decide who belongs where, then it's time someone reminded her exactly whose name is on those uniforms. Back on the aircraft, Leonard Blake, the older gentleman across from Amira, cleared his throat again. Amira turned slowly. I hope you don't mind me saying this, he began, voice gravelly with age, but I admire how you handled all that. She regarded him silently. I've flown for business for most of my adult life. I've seen people cause scenes over spilled drinks or missed meals. But you stood your ground without ever raising your voice. Amira offered a faint nod, unsure what to say. There was no template for this kind of compliment, no script for what dignity looked like in midair. He hesitated. It wasn't fair what she did, and I'm sorry no one said something sooner. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, the plane felt very small. I'm not looking for apologies, she said. I'm looking for people to see what's happening when it does. He blinked, and then slowly nodded. In the rear cabin, Clara stared down the aisle toward first class. A pale anxiety bloomed in her chest, edged with something unfamiliar. Shame. Not the shame of being caught, the shame of finally seeing herself. She'd always thought of herself as fair, as professional, but fairness wasn't about being neutral. It was about being honest with what lay beneath your instincts. And today, when she looked at that girl, lone, young, black, her brain hadn't said passenger. It had said question mark. And now, that single mental flicker might unravel everything she had worked for. She was still lost in thought when the in-flight phone buzzed beside Anne. She picked it up with practiced calm. Yes, it was the captain. Clara, I have just received a relay from corporate. You're being asked to remain on board after landing. Security will escort you for an internal review. The silence that followed was not from shock. It was from inevitability. She closed her eyes briefly, then whispered, Understood. When she hung up, she didn't cry. Not yet. But her hand trembled as she reached for a cup of water, because for the first time in her long career, Clara Whitman realized she had flown too long without questioning her altitude. The moment the plane's wheels kissed the tarmac, a soft exhale rippled through the cabin. Not loud, not relieved, just the unspoken shift of people coming back down to earth. The city outside had begun to gray, morning light fading into the haze of late afternoon. Yet inside the aircraft, tension still hung like mist, especially near the front rows. In seat 2A, Amira Langston sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her phone face down on the tray table, unread. She hadn't touched it since the apology. Her breathing was steady, but her chest felt heavy, not from anxiety, but from the strange stillness that followed injustice being acknowledged, yet not undone. The world hadn't shifted, but something within it had been exposed. She felt it in the way other passengers now looked at her, not with pity, nor quite admiration, but with a quiet sort of awareness, a discomfort. The kind people feel when they realize they've witnessed something wrong and said nothing. Across from her, Leonard Blake reached down to tighten his seatbelt, his hands moving slowly as though reluctant to accept that the flight was ending. He glanced toward Amira, but said nothing this time. Perhaps he understood that words now would only sit clumsily between them. Near the galley, Clara Whitman stood like a statue in uniform. Her posture remained upright, precise. She didn't tremble, didn't fidget, but inside her thoughts raced. She'd spent the remainder of the flight replaying every second since takeoff. The raised eyebrow, the hesitation before taking the boarding pass, the exact moment she let instinct override protocol. I didn't check the manifest. That truth rang louder than any engine hum. She had made assumptions. Assumptions that bypassed all her training, her years of service, and the values her badge was supposed to represent. And she hadn't just embarrassed a young passenger. She had violated the invisible contract of trust every airline employee was expected to uphold. That all passengers were to be treated with fairness, dignity, and clarity. And Amira Langston had caught her in the act of forgetting that. As the seatbelt sign turned off, movement resumed in the cabin. Passengers stood, stretching, opening overhead bins with the rustle and rhythm of routine. But this time, eyes darted toward the front, toward Amira, and toward Clara. No one said anything aloud, but something had changed in the silence. The curtain between first class and the galley shifted slightly as Emily Rhodes stepped forward. "I've got this aisle," she offered to Clara gently. Clara gave a slight nod and stepped aside. She appreciated it, and she knew why it was being offered. She was being removed from view. Passengers began disembarking, one by one. A few stole glances at Amira as they passed, and though none spoke to her directly, their expressions held something new: thoughtfulness, regret, respect. When Leonard passed by, he placed a hand briefly on the headrest of her seat, not touching her, not intruding, just a quiet gesture. "You reminded us all what grace looks like," he said softly. Amira looked up, just slightly, and met his gaze, then nodded. Outside the aircraft, the jet bridge was busy with activity, but not the kind passengers could see. Two security officers stood flanking a man in a dark suit, holding a folder and wearing an expression that blended courtesy with finality. His name tag read, "Daniel Harper, Human Capital Affairs, SkyNova." When the last passenger exited, the crew door opened. "Miss Whitman," Mr. Harper said as he boarded, his voice neutral, "you'll need to stay on board." Clara, who had been waiting for it, gave a small nod and stepped forward. Emily, standing just behind her, whispered, "I'll close out the galley." Clara didn't look back. As she stepped into the bridge, her stomach knotted. Not from fear, but from knowing what came next wasn't a misunderstanding to be clarified. It was a choice that had revealed a pattern, and now there would be consequences. Meanwhile, in the first-class lounge, Amira sat near the tall windows overlooking the runway, a quiet sanctuary wrapped in beige leather and soft jazz. The room felt almost too serene for what had just happened. But Amira didn't relax. She waited. Her phone buzzed once. A message. "I'm 10 minutes away. Stay there, Dad." She didn't reply. Instead, she turned toward the window again. Outside, the aircraft she had just disembarked from stood quietly on the apron, bathed in soft light. From this angle, she could see the movement. Small figures at the cabin door, the slow roll of luggage carts, the trailing presence of airport security. She watched as Clara was escorted out of view, flanked by two officers and followed by Mr. Harper. There were no cameras, no announcement, just a silent fall from altitude. Amira watched her go, not with vengeance in her heart, but with clarity, because some lessons aren't taught through shouting or confrontation. Some are taught by simply standing your ground and letting the truth be undeniable. The conference room inside the terminal building was neither lavish nor cold, just neutral, beige walls, soft overhead lighting, a polished wood table flanked by four leather chairs. But to Clara Whitman, it might as well have been a courtroom. She sat on one side, back straight, hands folded in her lap, eyes locked on the closed door opposite her. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was loaded. There were no windows, no clock. Time passed, but not in minutes, in thoughts. What would they ask? What would they already know? What could she say that wouldn't sound rehearsed, or worse, hollow? Then the door clicked open. Daniel Harper entered first, followed by a younger woman in a navy blazer, Alexis Monroe, SkyNova's director of compliance. Behind them, a third person entered and closed the door gently. Victor Langston. He wasn't scheduled to attend. His presence made Clara's stomach lurch. "Miss Whitman," Harper said, taking the seat across from her. His tone was even. "You're aware of why you're here?" "Yes," Clara said softly. Alexis opened a file. Inside, passenger statements, a flight log, the manifest, and an official incident complaint submitted within 15 minutes of landing. Harper continued, "We'll keep this brief. You removed a paying passenger from their assigned first-class seat without consulting the manifest, the gate agent, or the in-flight tablet. Is that correct?" Clara hesitated. Victor Langston didn't move, didn't blink. "Yes," she said finally. "That's correct." Harper nodded slowly. "And can you explain your reasoning?" There it was. The question. Not about procedure, but why. Clara's mouth felt dry. She shifted slightly. "I made a judgment call." "Based on?" Another pause. This one longer. "I didn't recognize her as a first-class passenger." "Because she was young?" Alexis asked. Clara hesitated. Harper's voice was firm now. "Because she was black?" Clara looked down. "I didn't mean—" "But you did," Victor said at last. His voice was quiet, steady, but cut like glass. "You looked at a teenage girl, alone, composed, carrying herself with dignity, and you assumed she didn't belong." Clara looked up at him. There was no anger in his face, just disappointment, the kind that weighed heavier than rage. "I didn't do it to be cruel." "No," he said, "you did it because it was easy." Clara swallowed hard. Victor leaned forward slightly. "Let me tell you what you actually did. You made my daughter, who has never caused a scene in her life, walk to the back of the plane as if she had stolen something. You did that with witnesses, with silence around you. And worst of all, you did it without even thinking. He pushed a printed copy of the complaint forward. Her name was circled in red ink. You weren't just wrong, he said. You were careless with someone else's dignity. No one spoke for a long time. Clara's fingers tightened. I've served this company for 15 years, she said finally. I've trained staff. I've volunteered for conflict flights. I've never had a complaint. That's exactly why this matters, Alexis replied. Because someone who trains others cannot afford to be blind to their own biases. Clara felt her chest tighten. She could argue. She could deflect. But everything would sound like an excuse. And even she, deep down, knew she didn't deserve to be rescued from this. Harper folded his hands. You're not being terminated today. Clara blinked. You're being offered a choice. She looked between them. Alexis slid a form across the table. You may accept immediate suspension with pay while completing a mandatory corrective course, bias recognition and passenger equity. The program lasts 12 weeks. It includes interviews with passengers who have experienced discrimination and guided simulations with real-time response evaluation. Clara scanned the document. It wasn't just training, it was humbling. If completed successfully, Harper added, you may reapply for cabin crew at a non-senior level. No fast-track promotions. No leadership for 2 years. And if I decline, Clara asked. Victor looked at her directly. Then this ends here, and so does your career with SkyNova. The room fell silent again. Clara looked down at the pen. She could walk away, pretend this had been an overreaction, tell herself that corporate was just covering ground because of the last name involved. But she knew better. This wasn't about Victor Langston's power. It was about her own reflection. Slowly she picked up the pen. Her hand trembled, but she signed. When she looked up again, Victor was already standing. He said nothing more. But the message had landed. Elsewhere in the terminal, Amira Langston sat across from her father in a quiet section of the SkyNova Executive Lounge. The coffee between them had gone cold, untouched. Victor finally spoke. She's agreed to take the course. Amira nodded slowly. Good. She'll be under review. No more first class for her. At least not until she earns it. Amira didn't smile, but her eyes softened. She doesn't need to be punished, Dad, she said. She needs to learn. Victor studied her. You sure you're okay? Amira looked out the window, then back at him. I will be, as long as this doesn't happen to the next girl who walks on board. Victor exhaled. It won't. Not if I have anything to do with it. Amira leaned back in her chair. The storm had passed, but the sky would remember. 3 days later, the story broke. Not because Amira Langston posted about it, not because her father demanded a headline, but because someone else had been listening. A passenger, Leonard Blake, the older gentleman from Seat 2C, had written a letter. A quiet, articulate piece addressed to the Chronicle of Air Travel, a well-respected industry journal. The headline read simply, When Silence Sat Beside Me in 2A. It was not inflammatory. There were no names mentioned. No shaming, just a narrative. A first-person account of watching a teenage girl removed from her rightful seat in first class, forced to walk the aisle of shame without protest, and later quietly returned with an apology that came far too late. I didn't speak, Blake wrote. And in not speaking, I became part of the silence that allowed it. The piece went viral within hours. Airline employees shared it in private forums. Former passengers posted their own stories of silent bias. And soon, Victor Langston was on the phone with the SkyNova board, not to discuss PR spin, but to initiate reform. In a brightly lit meeting room at SkyNova headquarters, the board sat around a long oval table as Victor stood at the front, sleeves rolled up, eyes firm. "We can't pretend this was an isolated mistake," he said. "Clara Whitman may have acted alone, but the ease with which she made that assumption didn't come from nowhere. It came from a culture we haven't challenged enough." Several executives nodded, some uncomfortably. "We've had the policies," Victor continued, "but we haven't lived them. And now we've been shown, not by outrage, but by a girl who said almost nothing, and by a man who admitted he said nothing at all." He clicked to the next slide of the presentation. Project Seat, seeing everyone at their table. Effective immediately, we're launching a passenger equity audit across all North American routes. Every crew will undergo simulation-based training on unconscious bias. We will monitor seat reassignment reports for the next 12 months, and we will appoint a passenger equity liaison to review complaints outside of the standard HR pipeline. The room was silent for a moment. Then came the first question. "Who's leading this?" Victor replied simply, "She is." That afternoon, Amira Langston sat quietly in her father's office, unsure how to feel. "You want me to help design the program?" she asked. Victor nodded. "Not as a figurehead, not as my daughter, as someone who lived it." Amira looked down at her hands. "I'm not sure I'm the right person," she murmured. "I'm just a kid who wanted to sit by the window." "And that's exactly why you're the right one," Victor said. "Because if someone like you can be treated that way, it means no amount of policy matters unless we build systems that listen to people who don't have power." Amira looked up slowly. "And if I say yes?" Victor leaned back. "Then I'll clear a space at the table. The one they tried to keep you out of." For the first time in days, she smiled, just slightly. "I'd rather build the table myself." Elsewhere, Clara Whitman sat in a small, quiet training room wearing civilian clothes. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly. Across from her sat a woman in her 40s, medium build, plain slacks, no uniform. Her name was Renee Holloway. "I'm not here to judge you," Renee began. "I'm here to walk with you through the uncomfortable parts." Clara said nothing. Renee continued, "This isn't about shaming, it's about seeing. And that first requires honesty." Clara folded her hands. "I didn't wake up thinking I'd humiliate a teenager." "No one ever does," Renee said gently. "But we all wake up with filters, assumptions. Bias isn't about malice, it's about speed. Our brain taking shortcuts. The problem is shortcuts hurt people." Clara exhaled. "I saw her hoodie, her backpack. I thought, no way she's in 2A. "What Renee Bray asked simply. Clara didn't answer right away. She stared at the tiled floor for a long time. Then, "Because people like her don't usually sit there." And there it was. The truth, stripped bare of justification. Renee nodded once. "Thank you. That's where we begin." By the end of the week, the Chronicle published a follow-up article. "The Girl in 2A Speaks." It wasn't written by Amira directly. It was adapted from a private speech she gave during her first planning session with the airline's reform committee. She didn't name names. She didn't accuse. She only told the truth. "I didn't lose my seat because of a mistake. I lost it because someone looked at me and decided I didn't fit the picture. And that matters, because it means we're still painting pictures of who belongs in comfort and who belongs in silence. The article ended with her closing line. I didn't raise my voice, but I stayed in the room, and I think sometimes that's what justice sounds like. The interview request came 3 days after the article was published. It arrived via email from a senior producer at Horizon Spotlight, a respected nightly news program known for long-form features on social issues. The subject line was brief. We'd like to hear Amira's voice. Amira stared at the message for a long time, not because she didn't know what to say, but because she wasn't sure she wanted to say it to the world. She had told her story already, quietly, through the policy group, through her notes, through her silence. Wasn't that enough? She forwarded the email to her father with a single line. Should I do this? Victor Langston didn't call. He didn't insist. He replied, only if you feel it will help someone else. The interview was recorded in a quiet studio with soft lighting, 2 chairs, and no audience. The host, Lena Graham, was calm, empathetic, and asked questions like she was pulling threads from silk. Why didn't you speak up on the plane? She asked gently. Amira smiled faintly. Because I knew no one was listening to hear me, only to correct me. And when your seat was taken? I didn't lose my seat, Amira said calmly. She gave it to a version of the world that made her comfortable. I just wasn't part of that version. The interview aired on a Friday evening. By Monday morning, it had over 6 million views on social media. And something began to shift. Teachers played it in classrooms. HR managers forwarded it to their teams. Universities invited Amira to speak at youth leadership panels, though she declined each time. And quietly under the radar, a new trend began to form. First-class passengers began to report biased interactions, not to complain, but to challenge what had once been routine. SkyNova's equity inbox received over 1,400 personal accounts from Black and brown passengers who said they had been looked at sideways, doubted silently, or moved without reason. A memo from Victor Langston to the board called it a reckoning wrapped in civility. And through it all, Amira Langston said almost nothing. But people listened anyway. Meanwhile, in a nondescript office tucked into a corporate training center, Clara Whitman sat across from a screen, playing back a recording of herself, taken during one of her first flights as lead attendant. On the screen, she smiled politely at a passenger. She laughed with a colleague. She gave instructions with grace. And yet, as the training facilitator paused the video and looked at her, Clara felt only hollow recognition. Who is she? The facilitator asked. Clara blinked. That's me. No, the woman said. That's who you thought you were. But this past month you have had to meet the other version, the one your passengers saw when you weren't paying attention. Clara closed her eyes. The course had been more brutal than expected, not because it was harsh, but because it forced her to look at others, at herself, at her patterns. She had written apology letters to 4 former passengers already, each one reviewed by an internal ethics coach, each one paired with flight notes from the manifest, crew reports, and even gate agent logs. She had cried twice, and still she had more to go. Victor Langston wasn't seeking public apologies. He had told the board, I don't want tearful statements. I want patterns disrupted. So Project Seat expanded. Airline partners across 3 continents requested access to the training materials. A coalition of equity officers from 5 major carriers signed on to develop universal passenger dignity standards. A new reporting app, quietly named WingCheck, was launched, allowing passengers to log interactions they felt were biased or dismissive, complete with seat numbers, crew names, and outcomes. And every one of those outcomes was now reviewed by a new, hand-picked oversight group, led by Amira, not officially, not on payroll, not in the headlines, but everyone knew. One morning, Clara was asked to give a reflection speech, part of her final evaluation in the 12-week course. It would be recorded, shared internally. She stood at the front of the modest classroom wearing no uniform, no makeup, no clipboard. "My name is Clara Whitman," she began, her voice a little hoarse, "and I used to believe I was the standard of professionalism in the skies." She paused, a few heads lifted. "But now I know that I was also the gatekeeper of someone else's belonging, and I did it quietly, routinely, without malice, which is what makes it worse." Her fingers trembled, but she didn't stop. "I didn't yell. I didn't insult. But I removed a girl from her seat because I decided she didn't look like she belonged in comfort. And that act, that small, silent act, held more violence than I knew." Silence. Then from the back, a voice murmured, "And what now?" Clara looked toward the sound. "Now I sit in the seat I gave away," she said. "I sit in it every day, until I no longer need to be reminded that she earned it." That night, Amira sat in her room, curled into a blanket, watching the sunset dim across the skyline. Her phone buzzed, a text from someone she didn't know. "I've always been afraid to speak up, but you showed me that I can still take up space. Thank you." Amira stared at it, then replied simply, "Keep your seat. You deserve it." A low-quality audio recording uploaded to a niche aviation forum, titled simply, "SkyNova Training Session, What They Say When No One's Listening." The voice was unmistakable, calm, confident, and laced with something colder than policy. "Look, first class is about maintaining a certain environment yet," said the speaker. "If someone boards and they don't, match the profile. Don't start a confrontation. Just seat them in economy, quietly. No one complains if you're discreet." For 43 seconds, the file played a conversation between two mid-level training supervisors discussing passenger optics and brand image. No direct names, but enough coded language to raise every red flag. The clip spread like wildfire. By mid-morning, passenger optics was trending on social media. By noon, SkyNova stock had taken a 4.7% dip. By 2 p.m., Amira Langston's name was trending again, only this time not because of what she'd said, but because of what she had revealed. In the boardroom at SkyNova's headquarters, the atmosphere was scorched. "We need a statement immediately," the VP of Communications barked, pacing. Victor Langston sat quietly at the head of the table, the only black executive in the room. His silence was not indecision, it was calculation. "This recording didn't surprise me," he said finally. "And if we pretend it did, we insult every passenger who's ever been on the receiving end of that tone." The room fell still. "We don't need a statement," Victor continued. "We need a reckoning, and we need her to lead it." Someone at the table glanced up. "Amira?" Victor didn't blink. "She saw this before we did. She lived it. Now she defines how we answer for it." At that moment, Amira Langston was in a coffee shop downtown, laptop open, headphones in. She hadn't seen the news. She was reading a training manual. Editing the section on tone and assumption, she'd been working on it for 3 days, writing quietly, revising carefully. Her phone buzzed. It was her father. The message was short. Call me. They want you to speak to the nation. Hours later, Amira sat in a private media suite preparing for a live press conference. Not just any conference. SkyNova had called a national address, not to defend, not to deny, but to surrender the mic and hand it to her. The room was white, clean, minimalist. Her name card was placed neatly in front of the podium. Behind it, a banner read, "Every seat earned, every voice heard." The CEO stood beside her, and beside him, the head of legal, the director of training, and Victor Langston. But when the cameras clicked on, it was only Amira who stepped forward. She wore no corporate badge, only a navy blazer, a soft gray shirt, and the quiet composure of someone who had once been told, without words, that she did not belong. She looked out at the cameras, the journalists, the room full of decision makers who had finally chosen to listen. Then she began. When I boarded Flight 417 last month, I didn't expect to be a symbol. I expected a window seat. What happened that day was not about one attendant. It was about the quiet way we all participate in assumption, the training that isn't on the books, but lives in glances, in silences, in who we ask to prove themselves. This is not just an airline issue. This is a culture issue. She paused. Today, SkyNova isn't just launching a program. It's admitting that sometimes we've handed out comfort selectively and called it customer service. She looked directly into the lens. I didn't fight for a refund or a statement. I fought for the next girl who boards alone, the one with braids, the one with a name you mispronounce, the one who brings her own headphones, her own calm, her own boarding pass. I fought so she doesn't have to. The room was silent. Then came a wave of quiet clapping, steady, reverent, from press and employees alike. Behind her, Victor closed his eyes briefly. He had seen his daughter as brilliant, but he had never realized she would also be braver than him. Back in the training center, Clara Whitman watched the live stream alone. She didn't cry, but her eyes didn't leave the screen for a second. She saw in Amira the very thing she hadn't allowed herself to see on that plane. Presence, not defiance, not entitlement, just presence and the aching truth that she had once mistaken it for a threat. At the end of the press conference, Amira was asked if she would consider becoming the official passenger equity advisor for SkyNova. She didn't say yes immediately. She looked out the window behind the stage. Planes were lifting into sky. Somewhere out there, another teenage girl was boarding, another version of herself, someone carrying dreams, stories, and no armor. I'll think about it, she said, but only if I still get the window seat. 2 months later, the gate at Terminal 5 looked different. The SkyNova staff wore new uniforms. Nothing dramatic, but symbolic. A navy blue pin bearing 3 small silver dots sat above every crew member's name tag. The dots represented 3 values now codified in the airline's revised training program: presence, dignity, access. The gate screen flashed a new policy just beneath the flight number: passenger equity certified crew, manifest reviewed. And on this particular morning, Flight 417 was once again boarding to New York City. But this time, it wasn't just another flight. It was Flight Seat 01. the inaugural flight under SkyNova's newly implemented every seat earned protocol, and every media outlet in the country had eyes on it. Amira Langston didn't board until the final group, not because she had to wait, but because she wanted to observe. As she reached the podium, the gate agent looked up, smiled warmly, and said without hesitation, "Welcome aboard, Miss Langston. Your seat's already waiting." She nodded softly, stepped through the gate, and into a cabin transformed. The lighting was warmer. The walls featured subtle decals of wings spread wide, not corporate logos, but symbols of equal lift. And each row of first class had a new card tucked into the seat pocket. "You are here because you belong." No explanation required. As Amira sat in 2A, she took a deep breath. The seat felt different, not because of the cushion, but because of what it now stood for. At the back of the plane, Clara Whitman, no longer in a senior role, stood beside the beverage cart. She had requested this flight, not to be seen, but to start again. She greeted each passenger with sincerity, not performance. She looked them in the eye, learned their names, verified their seat numbers, not to question, but to confirm and welcome. When she reached first class, she paused briefly beside 2A. Amira looked up. Their eyes met. This time, no tension, no apology, just a quiet mutual understanding. Clara offered a simple phrase. "Anything you need, Miss Langston." Amira smiled gently. "A glass of water. Window open." Clara nodded, then added quietly, "And thank you for building this." 30 minutes into the flight, the captain made an announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, today marks not just a flight path to New York, but a step forward in the way we fly together. You are flying aboard the first fully passenger equity certified route in our company's history. We hope the comfort you feel is not just in the seat, but in the acknowledgement of your presence." The cabin stirred with light applause. Amira didn't clap. She just looked out the window. She didn't need to be celebrated. She needed this to last. 6 weeks later, a congressional subcommittee on transportation ethics cited Flight 417 as a case study for dignity-centered service. Amira declined to testify. She'd said what she needed to say. Instead, she submitted a written statement, just one paragraph long. "In the air, we are all weightless. It is only on the ground that we remember who we think belongs above others." If equity means anything, it means remembering that humanity doesn't need upgrades. It just needs to be seen. Meanwhile, Clara Whitman completed the full 90-day certification. She chose to start fresh as a standard crew member, rejecting offers to return to a leadership role. She no longer barked orders. She no longer braced against accountability. Instead, she carried a folded copy of Amira's Chronicle interview in her bag, reminding herself every day that silence does not absolve. At SkyNova headquarters, a permanent installation was unveiled in the lobby, a life-size photograph of Seat 2A, empty, quiet, and lit by soft sunrise through the cabin window. Beneath it, engraved in silver, "The seat was always hers. The lesson is ours." Moral of the story: this story isn't about a flight. It's about the thousands of small moments that build a culture, one question at a time, one glance at a time, one assumption at a time. It's about the damage we cause not with shouting, but with doubt. Not by pushing, but by quietly moving people out of place. And it's about the power of one person, young, compassionate, unshaken, who decides not to shout back, but to stay in her seat until the world sees her clearly. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive in thunder. Sometimes it sits down, buckles in, and waits for the cabin to catch up.